All right, again, welcome everyone. Today's presentation is one in our series that we've been having all year long. It is our next part in the Cultural Heritage Board speaker series that is titled A Shared History, Diverse Voices Across Ventura County. Today's presentation is the next part of our series. The intent of this series is to promote meaningful public humanities learning and community dialogue focused on traditionally underrepresented voices and stories and their contribution to Ventura County's history. Part of the Cultural Heritage Board's role is working to help educate the community and share information on the county's historic resources, including those that are socially and culturally important. Today's event is the third part of the series, which will continue into next spring. These sessions will feature scholars and local voices and are intended to create space for questions and dialogue to foster mutual understanding. All sessions are recorded for later viewing. I'm going to turn things over to our Vice Chair, Miguel Fernandez.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're happy to have Dr. Frank P. Barajas speak to us on life and legacy of labor leader and civil rights activist César Chávez in Ventura County. By way of background, Dr. Barajas is a professor of history with a specialty in the history of Southern California. After 32 years in academics, 9 of them at Cypress College and 22 at Cal State University, Channel Islands, Dr. Barajas ended his full-time teaching career as a full professor in August of 2023. However, he continues to teach part-time and research and write on the history and culture of Southern California as it relates to Chicano communities. He has published peer-reviewed articles on labor strife in the city of Oxnard, youth culture in Los Angeles during the 1940s, and the city of Oxnard's implementation of a civil gang injunction in 2004. Born and raised in the city of Oxnard 60 years ago, he is also the author of 2 books, Curious Unions, Mexican-American Workers and Resistance in Oxnard, California between 1898 and 1961, published in 2012, and Mexican-Americans with Moxie, a transgenerational history of El Movimiento Chicano in Ventura County, California, between 1945 and 1975, and that was published in 2021. He's now working on a project examining the continuation of El Movimiento Chicano in Ventura County to 2008. So with that, I'd like to please ask you to join us in welcoming Dr. Frank P. Barajas.
Well, welcome everyone. How are we doing out there? Good. I always have a little bit of anxiety when I come to the government center. You know, I don't know what it is. It's either jury duty or, you know, something legal, not on my part, or, you know, so I always have this kind of this dream about my house being repossessed because no taxes, and not paying my taxes. You know? I don't know what it is. But no, I do really enjoy coming here, and the architecture is really historic, actually. So thank you to the Heritage Board for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I have to be really deliberate where I put my items because I'm one of those people that I'll place something down and I'll move for like 5 seconds and I lost it, right? So in this I have my notes. I'm going to move around just because I feel more comfortable. I'm going to project my voice. Can you hear me okay back there? Oh, okay. All right. Well, okay. Oh, come towards you. All right. I feel better about that. So I have my notes, and I had the concluding remarks. I'm going to read the concluding remarks first, because I think for 2 reasons. Because concluding remarks can really be a good introduction rather than a conclusion, right? And I leave talks, and I always forget like the most important things I wanted to say, right? So I'm going to tell you the most important things that I believe that César Chávez has to us as residents of Ventura County, but also the nation, if not the world. And I come from a family of agricultural workers. I've never worked in the fields. I've never worked in agriculture, but my parents and grandparents have. So I grew up with stories at the kitchen table. Matter of fact, I was watching La Bamba last night, coming back from San Juan Bautista last night from seeing a play by Teatro Campesino. And in the movie La Bamba, there's the opening scene is that they're at a labor camp, right? And that's the only scene my dad remembers about that movie. And he cringes at that opening scene because it's an opening scene of where it's like they're camping, but they're not camping. That's their way of life, where they're working over an open fire, living in tents, no sanitation, no running water, out in the elements. And when it rains, oftentimes these tents were not waterproof. And it was a life of misery, complete and utter misery. And children were being pulled out of school to work in the migrant circuit. So their education was impacted severely. And they were always behind. And they were always in a life of precarity. And that's what César Chávez lived. So his story is really a story of agricultural workers from different backgrounds. You know, poor white agricultural workers, poor black agricultural workers, poor Asian American agricultural workers, Japanese. And it's through César Chávez that we get that he became the voice for the voiceless, actually. And I have to say that because I have some of my friends here that are historians, and there's been a debate about César Chávez, right, in terms of him being authoritarian, being not able to give up power and delegate authority, and all these other things, and Synanon practices. Then I also know people who are actually veterans of the farm worker movement, who actually left college, if not high school, to volunteer for the movement of the United Farm Workers Union. And one thing that individuals will say in regards to this, kind of this historical reevaluation of César Chávez is he's a human being, right? Because there's a tendency to put him on a pedestal as being saint-like. But he was a human being like us that had strong points and points where there could have been improvement. So I don't mean to be hagiographic, if you want to use that term, put him to a place of sainthood, but to present him as a human being that represented the interest of a population in the United States that was deemed invisible. And even today, they're invisible. I work at Cal State Channel Islands, and I drive by lemon orchards. Every day I go there, and I don't see workers. I always wonder, it's like, when do they come pick lemons, right? Early in the morning, or late at night? Because I don't see them when I'm driving through. I do see strawberry workers, and I make it a point to pay attention to recognize them as human beings. But there are a lot of people that drive by strawberry fields and don't even see them when they're out there working. So César Chávez brought people into visibility. And in regards to demanding living wages, demanding housing, demanding healthcare services, demanding educational opportunities for individuals. And first and foremost, within all these demands, these were demands of dignity. Demands of dignity. Demands for being recognized as human beings. Not just workers in which that could be taken advantage of, but individuals that had value. And that's how we measure our value in terms of wages, don't we not? So if we're not being paid a living wage, that means your value as a human being is being minimized And that's the reason why you had families migrating from place to place as families, because the wages were so meager. Just to survive for food and shelter, everyone had to work that was able. So César Chávez represented that experience. And with that, this is all happening as he matures during the civil rights movement. He comes to prominence in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Well, what's happening then? You know, it's post-World War II. We see the civil rights movement emerge in the early 1950s. It's really picking up speed in the late 1950s, and then we'll get into the 1960s. And by 1965, we have the grape strike from 1965 to 1970. So we have to historically contextualize that. And another aspect of César Chávez that we have to walk away with is that he recognized talent. Because that's how he was taught. In regards to Fred Ross, who was his mentor, recognized César Chávez as a community organizer. So he was able to spot people and see abilities that people could not see in themselves, right? And tapped into that potential. That's one thing that I want you, and I say that because there are individuals that I know in Ventura County who had corporations, you know, nonprofits now, and work in government entities, and they're CEOs and top-level managers who started their careers, if not lawyers, who started their careers as volunteers for the United Farm Workers, with little to no experience in what they were doing, right? But he exhibited a willingness to sacrifice and a willingness to learn. So that's another takeaway that I wanted to leave with you. And one that he represents an individuals that influence different generations. The elderly, people within his own generation, and also youth. And he was able to articulate the experiences of these different generations for them to follow him. Right? So in a way, César Chávez is our Martin Luther King. To put him up there, right? He's our Martin Luther King, in which he articulated the dreams and desires and the challenges of farm workers. And in this case, you know, people of ethnic Mexican origin. And I say ethnic Mexican origin because they were recent immigrants, they were long-term immigrants, they were Mexican Americans, and also children. Right? So he was able to tap into that. And that's his legacy. So we got to the end of the presentation. That's his legacy, right? His legacy is in me. His legacy is in you, and his ideals live on, and they're being passed on, right? We have farm worker housing, right, in terms of the Cabrillo Economic Development Corporation, which the founder, Rodney Fernandez, you know, was part of that civil rights Chicana movement era, who got caught up in terms of the farm worker movement in regards to Cabrillo Village, right, in Saricoy. They were being evicted from their homes, long-term homes, labor camp homes. And I'll get to that story in a few minutes, but we have people in this room that come from Cabrillo Village, right, who've gone on to be professionals in different areas, right? And I'm sure that those stories, if they didn't witness it themselves, they heard the stories from at the kitchen table. Right? They heard the stories of how it was to be a migrant worker, if not lived it themselves. They heard stories in terms of abuse, right, and exploitation, and maybe in ways in which maybe academics don't articulate, right? Right now I'm finishing a book. I'm finishing a book by Viktor Frankl. It's always been that book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's much more than just a book about the concentration camps during Nazi Germany. It's much more than that. It's kind of a self-help book too, right? And he talks about how meaning, two things go close with meaning is responsibility and suffering. So if anything you want to do, there's going to be an element of suffering, right? Anything you do, even if you want to do it, there's suffering involved, right? Wow, that's pretty. And then I was thinking when I was getting ready for this morning, because I always have presentations. People say, "Oh, you just probably walk in there." I could if I want to, but I always prep. I mean, I've done this presentation, and I was getting ready and grooming myself. I go, wow. And I remember my abuelita, she was from Chihuahua, came to this country in the early 1960s as a single mother escaping a toxic, abusive relationship with 4 little girls from Chihuahua. With 4 little girls to a country that she didn't understand English, and she had limited, capital. And I always remember when she spoke to me in Spanish, she said, "Mijo, sufrí mucho." And if you talk to a migrant worker or a farm worker, they always say that, "Sufrí mucho." I suffered a lot, right? And I really didn't understand that until I read, I finished it this morning actually, right? Because he talks about suffering. And so I want you to consider that's what César Chávez articulated to people, the idea of suffering. And himself suffered and sacrificed, right? So there he is in the 1930s. They lost in Arizona. They were not sharecroppers. They were homesteaders, and they lost their land during the Great Depression, which was a signal that capitalism was failing. It was failing. I mean, the Communist Party was a populist party because capitalism was not really delivering, right? You had 30% unemployment, if not higher, depending who you were. When we get to 10%, we think the sky is falling, right? 10% unemployment, sky's falling. Imagine 20% for the general population. And if you were of the black community, it was 30% and plus. If you were a woman, geez, higher than that, right? And so I say that in terms of capitalism. You also have to understand when we're talking about agricultural work, why farm workers are paid so low, because they're the highest labor cost, right? And capitalism's number one goal is the maximization of profits, right? If you're a business person, you know that. How do you maximize profits? Cut your labor costs. That's what AI is all about, right? And you go to McDonald's, it's cheaper to have a machine than to pay somebody to take your order. And that's more and more being part of our lives, right? So same thing with agricultural workers. You exploit the most exploitable, and that's immigrant labor. And you also exploit even not just immigrant, but undocumented immigrant labor because they have no legal recourse. So we always have to think about the economics of things, right? I mean, like Martin Luther King, the Black Civil Rights Movement, yes, it's about equality, but it was also equality for economic opportunity. Who had the best jobs, right? And who didn't have the best jobs? And why? Who had the best schools? And who didn't have the best schools? And you went to the best schools, you got the best jobs, right? So during the 1930s, we see the Chavez family lose their property. And they become migrant workers. And the father is kind of like the scout. He comes to California, finds these leads through the networks, ends up in Oxnard. And the family then migrates. There's César Chávez in the middle with his brothers and sisters. Right there in the middle of that old car. And That's another part of the scene of La Bamba. They're all packed into one car. They have the mattress, kind of like the Joad family of Grapes of Wrath, right? If you watched the movie or read the book, they're all piled in. And they always have room, no matter how crowded the car is, the dog. Right? And you listen to the stories of your parents who were migrant workers, the dog is always, they never leave Spot, right? Spot comes along. Right, and it's part of this. And Spot's always smart, right? Like smartest dog I ever owned, right? Was when we were traveling as migrant workers. So that's that image. And it's through the Great Depression that César Chávez, experiences living in labor camps, living in tents with holes in them, right? Living in misery in rainy days, sleeping in mud. Right, drinking contaminated water in Madeira. That's my dad's story, actually. He said, "Oh, my dad had the worst water. It was rancid. It tasted, right? I drank kerosene by mistake." No, he did. That's one of the stories. He drank, it wasn't kerosene. It was kind of that oil they used for lighting. Actually, it was some kind of oil. But César Chávez lived that. He came from that. He was a U.S. citizen, too. I want to point that out. He wasn't from Mexico. And, just like many of us are not from Mexico, right? And California was a territory of Mexico. We don't have an immigration problem. The problem is that we have people that have been here for a long time, right? Santa Barbara, Sacramento, Camarillo, San Diego, right? These names didn't just pop up after 1848. Right? It's because we are living in conquered territory of the Mexican people. So there's César Chávez second from the right. And Fred Ross recruits him. Fred Ross is in the middle. That's his mentor. And he recruits him to be an organizer because he had heard about this César Chávez being a community leader in San Jose. And he joins the community service organization. And so he's in the far right. And Edward Roy Ball is right next to Fred Ross in the left. So if you've ever been to the Government Center in downtown LA, he was the first city councilman in many years in LA. Who was the community in Oxnard was organized in Los Angeles, and he got representation on the city council. Then from there, went to be a representative in Congress. So the CSO is a community organization in which César Chávez learns the principles of community organizing. And another individual there on the far left is Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky wrote a Germinal book. Many of you probably remember it if you grew up in the 60s and 70s. It's called Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Right? And the radical was basically a person who wanted democratic rights, constitutional rights. They were really reformist rights, like voting and end of segregation. But at that time, that was radical because people of color, women, didn't have those rights. So we always have to contextualize this, rules for radicals. Well, what were so radical about? Basic fundamental rights. Just like, math, square root, right? It's a radical, right? The most basic, right? That's the way it was explained to me, right? Makes sense, right? I'm no mathematician, but 64 radical is 8, right? I'll stop there before I get in trouble. And Saul Alinsky is organized. And I went to a demonstration one time, and they had all UFW workers. And volunteers and activists, and now I find myself I'm in that category now, right? And they after a play they started saying, "Viva César Chávez!" And they said, que viva Dolores Huerta, que viva, Pancho Villa, que viva. And then they say, que viva Saul Alinsky, and I was like, who's this Saul Alinsky guy, right? And Saul Alinsky was a community organizer that trained a lot of UFW workers and volunteers. He trained them how to become organizers. So he's there in the far left. and Herman Gallegos is right to the right of Fred Ross in the middle. In the middle there. So this is the community, and it's kind of a more middle-class oriented organization, hence the suit and ties, right? But you don't see César Chávez wearing suit and ties after he becomes a labor organizer, right? But it was this is known what they say in the college language, the striving for middle-class respectability, right? To wear a suit and tie. This is what we aspire to be. We aspire to be middle class and have the good things in life with it, all that come with that also. So they're all wearing suits. And Helen Chávez, let me just run up here real fast without hurting myself. This is César Chávez's wife. And I want to mention that because part of the history or the creation of history, because history is not just something that comes from the Mount Sinai and the burning bush, right? History is like, me trying to put something together. And oftentimes in the historical record, women's names are left out. Oftentimes they're left out. So you're trying to piece together, and Herman Gallegos told me all the names of all the women in this photograph. Then I'm in my notes this morning trying to find that piece of paper, and I can't find it, right? But I'm able to narrow down that Helen Chávez is his wife, because there wouldn't have been a César Chávez if it wasn't for Helen actually maintaining the family economically. She was working in the fields while César Chávez was organizing. So we see this often in terms of women are often elided from recognition. And if they are recognized, it's usually Mrs. César Chávez. It's not Mrs. Helen Chávez, right? It's Mrs. César Chávez. So we have that's part of what historians are working against in terms of trying to gain recognition. And so he becomes a community organizer. And Ralph Helfstein of the United Cannery and Packing House Workers of America, who was organizing citrus workers in packing plants, wants to organize in the citrus orchards. So he talks to Saul Alinsky, who talks to Fred Ross and says, okay, I want to organize communities, because you have an organized community, you have a community that's going to be already trained to labor organize, because they're already community organized, so they're going to complement each other. So the civic organization, CSO, is sort of like contracted by a labor organization, which reminds me, you can't separate civil rights from labor rights. They overlap so much, right? If you're going to picket, you're going to have to practice your right, the First Amendment right of protest, and to redress grievances from your government, right? And the freedom of expression. So that civil right is also a labor right, because oftentimes police and law enforcement worked in tandem with business owners to crush strikes, arrest them, create anti-picketing laws. City councils went along with it, and board of supervisors went out not just in Ventura County too, but also in other counties, Kern County, in which you have law enforcement working closely with industry to undermine worker rights for better pay, better working conditions, better pensions, and so forth. So this was the nexus point. So César Chávez has the one who's on the far right, looking at a clipboard, and Tony Del Buono is in the middle, and we also have Vera Gonzalez on the left, and on the right is I had my notes. I had made notes on this before I came here, and now I got to find the page. But anyway, let me see. Here we go. Carmen Islas. There's Carmen Islas on the right of Tony Bono, and between, and also to the left of Tony Bono and the right of César Chávez. So that's a community service organization, CSO. And you notice it's registered to vote. And they provided services to the community. One service was immigration, to deal with immigration issues with the community, because many were undocumented. Then once they had their residency established, then was to citizenship classes. So they offered English language classes. Then from the English language classes was also to pass the naturalization test. Right? Then from getting naturalized was to register to vote. Then from registering to vote was to vote. Right? So this was all integrated, and also within that, driver's licenses and also education for children. It was a family organization. That's what, hence going back to the CSO image before, men and women are working together. And also they welcomed youth. So they had these kind of auxiliaries for youth. And this is the intergenerational part. Adults were not just being unionized and organized, children were too. So the children that came of age in the late 1950s, early 60s, by the mid-1960s and early 70s, they're part of the Chicano movement. It's already being instilled in them to fight for your rights, to struggle, to suffer for your rights, to suffer in jail if you had to, if you're going to protest. This was part of the legacy. And part of why this is important is as an educator, because people of ethnic Mexican origin, and I grew up in this sort of school system, explicitly or implicitly were told and taught that Mexicans have all these deficiencies. They're apolitical, they're apathetic, they don't value education, they couldn't organize themselves out of a paper bag, right? All of this was usually in comparison to other groups. Why can't you get your act together like this group, right? But our history tells us no. If you study our history, we have a long history of collective action, a long history of resistance, a long history of struggle for this. And this is what this image represents. And if you look closely, going back, it says Latin, you see on the far left, and at the end you get the ANS Club. It's a Latin American Veterans Club. These are World War II veterans. And like African Americans, like Asian Americans, and also Mexican, they came back with this, hey, we're not going to tolerate second-class citizenship anymore. We are U.S. citizens, and we demand everything that the promise is given in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and also the Declaration of Independence. So you see these veterans with GI Bills. Many of them go to college, they get money, become lawyers, they become professionals, they own a home, they own a business. So now they have money, they have some money, not a lot of money, some money to hire lawyers. So when you have, discrimination in the schools or not getting lighting, you can fight back. And César Chávez's right-hand person was Juan Soria. In Oxnard, there's a school called the Soria School, Juan Soria School, Laguna Soria School. And why he's important, because he fought segregation in Oxnard, particularly in the schools. So segregation was not just a black civil rights issue. It was an issue for Mexicans in places like California, Ventura County, Texas, because the best schools were in the white neighborhoods and the shoddiest schools were in the neighborhoods of color. And there were inferior schools where that's where you sent the teachers that were on their way out. There's best years when the first 5 years, and after that it was diminishing returns, right? And that was our experience. And there was low expectations for students. When I tell my students, I expect the most from you in my class. I tell them that, and they get scared. I've never been, never have I been much been expected of me, right? So this is one. And he was the right-hand person, and I was able to get a oral history of Frank Bardacke, who wrote one of these important books on César Chávez. Recently, it's called Trampling Out the Vintage, if you're interested. Trampling Out the Vintage. And he did an oral history with Juan Soria, and he details how Juan Soria and César Chávez used to go driving through the Santa Clara River Valley. And how, I didn't know this until one of my son's classmates who lived in the outskirts of Somes, there are these feudal landlords that live there. They have these mansions that exist there. They have worker housing that I wish I owned, that I lived in. But power is always hidden. Power often does not expose itself, and César Chávez got to see how these agricultural captains of industry, how they live behind those behind those houses, those fields in the 118. Just take one of those side roads into, Malcolm, was it Canyon Road or Walnut Canyon Road, and one of those roads, and you'll see mansions behind them with millions and millions and millions of dollars. Wow, the workers are living in tents. Workers are living in discarded, cashiered trailer homes. That's the case in 2024. 2024, you're seeing, I had one of my colleagues, his father came, things are much better for farm workers. I go, I don't know. You're having at least 3 or 4 families in a 2-bedroom apartment right now, just to survive. So it challenges our idea that history is progressive, that it's always getting better. It's more cyclical. It comes and goes in cycles, as we're seeing now. So how did he organize people? By house meeting. He had these meetings, which I like to tell my students, if you want to know and then it doesn't really resonate with them anymore because that time is gone. It's like Tupperware parties of the 1970s and 80s. Remember that? Call your friends, and I'll try to sell them Tupperware, and you get a percentage, right? That's what the house meeting was about. There's I want you to do, Ralph, I want you to, can I have your house for a house meeting? Oh, sure, and invite all your neighbors, all your family, and they all came. And look at how packed the house is. And that's the way he organized. Because when he left the CSO in 1962, he left because the CSO did not want to go into farm labor organizing. And it was in Oxnard, he knew that was his calling, was to be a farm labor organizer. And he implored the CSO to be an organization to unionize. And they didn't want to do it, so he left. So he uses the CSO network in Delano and Bakersfield and Fresno, Sacramento, San Jose, Oxnard, Ventura, Santa Paula. Anybody from Santa Paula here? Santa Paula had a really strong CSO. And that's how he creates his National Farm Workers Association that gets renamed in the early 1970s to the UFW by organizing. And you can read the caption for yourself that, if I can get one person out of one meeting, I won, right? If I get another person in Saticoy, I won, right? If I get another person who's a true believer in Santa Paula, I won, right? And I'm going to use this organizing one person by one person, one house meeting by one house, to build a movement, and that's what he was able to do. And he went national. There's Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy with César Chávez in 1968, and Helen Chávez is to the left, right there, with the mantil. If you were a Catholic, you grew up with your mom and family, they went to service, they had the mantil over their head, right? I'm a cultural Catholic now, but I remember. So César has a fast during this grape strike that lasted from 1965 to 1970, and he had the strike because he was losing control of the strike, because the workers were being faced with violence. Violence from the police, violence from vigilantes hired by the growers. So the workers were fighting back with violence, and he was following the principles of Gandhi, that nonviolent resistance, nonviolent protest, because once it went violent, the sympathy, public support for the movement would wither away. So he understood, it was nonviolence in terms of principle and morality, but it was strategic too. Because when you fight back, usually people in power can blame you as being the violent one, right? The power turns things on its head, even though I'm getting beaten, right? But the powerful can say, well, I'm the one, because I'm fighting back, I'm the one that started it, right? It's usually the person that strikes last, the one that gets caught, right? So he was losing control, so he goes on a fast. It's over 20 days, and he breaks the fast, and Bobby Kennedy comes, Senator Bobby Kennedy, who's running for president. And he gave César Chávez in the movement his imprimatur. I love that term. He gave him his sanction, right? This is a legitimate movement. This is a movement that's worthy. This is a movement that is wholesome and real. And by breaking the fast with César Chávez, he told the world that this is the right side of history right here. Then we see the farm worker movement going to Santa Paula. So this is the history. It goes into Santa Paula. Friends of the farm workers. And they have a parade in Santa Paula, like a citrus parade or a lemon parade, or I forgot what it's called. Something. This is pretty gutsy right here. They create a float, Juan the Picker, to go down Santa Paula, which is the citrus capital of California. That's owned by the growers. The growers call the shots. Growers have control of all the agencies, school boards, housing authorities, police, sheriffs. They run the show. And Chicanos say, okay, we're going to have Juan the Picker float, right? We support César Chávez. And there's Bob Borrego. No, we're going the wrong way. Oh, let's see. There we go. Bob Borrego's the far right. And his daughter, Diana Borrego, became part of the Chicano movement and was part of the anti-Vietnam War campaign at San Fernando Valley State College, which now is Cal State Northridge, excuse me. I went to Fresno. So then students were energized by this. This is our UCSB students who have food donations, and they take it to Delano regularly. And I was looking at this image really carefully today, and I've seen this image many times, and I've looked at it. And this is another example of the elision of women from history. Only guys' names are on there. There's two women in the far right, kneeling down. Their names are not there, not listed. And this is part of the archive of UC San Diego, right? This happens regularly within the documentation of history. So we have this Juarez, Zapata, and Chavez food relief truck that goes to Delano because they have people that are working, working for free. They're donating their time. They have limited income. So then in the Ventura Star Free Press, if you remember the newspaper, Ventura County Star Free Press, the Friends of the Farm Workers take out this like full-page ad in support of César Chávez. Why? Because César Chávez is being pilloried by the press. He's being pilloried by the growers, pilloried by law enforcement as being this communist threat. Not a civil rights labor organ, but as a threat, anti-American. So they take out this full-page ad. We are Mexican Americans. That's another thing that's important. They're not saying we are Mexicans. We are Mexican Americans, even though many of them are Mexican or the sons and daughters of Mexican immigrants. They're putting in bold there, we are Mexican Americans. Like, you can't tell us we're un-American. We've been here and we're not newcomers. And they put their names to it. And if you look closely, and you can't see it, I'll send it to you if you want it, you'll see a lot of recognizable names. And many of those names now are probably in their 70s, if not early 80s, right? And so they're coming out publicly in support, and they're also donating money, not only to have this ad, but also to the movement itself. And this is one of the first strikes that happens in Ventura County. Well, first was actually a sister strike at Santa Paula, Fillmore. In 1974, there was a strike in Oxnard. Let me check my time here. In Oxnard, and this mobilizes not just the Oxnard strawberry workers, but you have to understand agricultural work is a network of workers from different places. So you'll have strawberry workers coming from Fillmore to work in Oxnard, or coming from Saticoy to work in Oxnard, or they're working for the Saticoy and Limonera Association, but many of them live in different parts of Ventura County, so they're networked with each other, and they're supporting each other. And this is an example, this is a blatant example where law enforcement comes in at one moment and sends its law enforcement, the Ventura County Sheriff sends on, well, we can't say the official command because they're not going to admit it, right? But they send their helicopter to hover just over the picketers. They're harassing the picketers to break up. If you've ever been under a helicopter in flight, underneath, it's dust and dirt, and they break. And one person, I won't mention the names because you got to be careful about things. One person picks up a rock and throws it at the helicopter. He's arrested for assault. He's arrested for assaulting an officer in the helicopter, right? And that just energized the movement, and they won the strike eventually. So, and then there's the Moore Park, Egg City strikes. And I say strikes. There were strikes in the late 1960s, the early 1970s, and the last one was about in 1970s. It was the largest egg producer in the country. Right? And if you talk to people who worked in Egg City or worked in the fields or worked in the orchards, living in camps was tough, but working in the fields was even tougher. I don't know if you've ever worked or work with citrus, particularly lemons. If you're picking lemons, did you know that lemons have spines? So you're constantly being poked and scratched and everything. And I was talking to my dad. My dad's 89, so I listened to many stories I've heard many times. And he just tells me how horrible it was working in the citrus fields. He said, I was a terrible picker. He's always like, I had the lowest yield. These old 70-year-old pickers were out picking me, but I just hated it. I mean, he could still like relive it in his mind right at that moment. And being stooped over picking strawberries, backbreaking. Right? And also, then there's the elements. Then top it off on that is the pesticides, the chemicals that are out there. And just imagine working in a chicken factory. Just imagine that. I mean, beyond the eggs. So that's Al Rojas, that's his name. Al Rojas was one. He's from Visalia. So that's Al Rojas in 1967, the late 70s, at the Moore Park Egg City strike. Then I found her name in the preparation for this presentation. This individual here, I've seen her in many photographs, but she's always nameless. And Ralph, you sent me the image over the weekend, and I looked it up closely, and I searched it on my own. Her name is Aocencia. It's weird. I never heard that name. Aocencia Garamia. And she's there everywhere. So this is another example of young and old, right? Young protesters, workers, middle-aged, and also senior citizens who are on the strike. So there's no separation in terms of age groups. It's like in the Chicano movement, usually is portrayed as a youth movement of young people who are radicalized and angry and mad. But they were being led by middle-aged people, if not senior citizens themselves. They were being organized. They were being taught the do's and don'ts, what you have to do. You have to get publicity. Like that movie Walkout. Sal Castro says, if you don't have the press there, the strike, the walkout never happened. You got to get the press out there. And there's César Chávez. I mean, this is part of the suffering part. This is at a march in Ventura, the Ventura Cemetery. And after the march in 1976, he says, I'm tired. I feel like I have the load of the world on me. And I think that image just says it all. Right? Look, he looks a bit emaciated. Right? So this is part of the suffering, but something that he believed in. That was his meaning. Right? That was his meaning. That was the reason for his being. And he was willing to suffer for it. So, and here we come to the Cabrillo village. Strikes were being won throughout Ventura County. And Mexican Americans with Moxie, Jess Gutierrez, who was a student at UCSB and worked in Ventura County and still lives in Ventura County. He was at the UFW office, and he was charting all the victories of the UFW in terms for representation and all the victories for labor strikes winning. And they were just kicking, and taking names. They were really effective about it. They were really angering the establishment. Because the establishment, there's also the element that people who own the land saw Mexicans as Mexicans. Oh, they're just Mexicans. And the Mexicans telling me telling me what I can pay. A Mexican's telling me what the conditions of work are. A Mexican is determining how to run my business. You know, this is no longer the invisible hand of laissez-faire capitalism. Now I'm being told, because these growers are highly connected in labor associations, growers associations, boards, and city councils. They're organized. They're unions under another name. Now they're having a union that they're not unionized, telling them what to do. So they figure out a major center of this movement are at the labor camps. These are long-standing labor camps that were points of organization. So what you do is you break up the labor camps to break up the union. And Cabrillo Village was one of the first examples. Then what happened? Rancho Césped happened in 1979. So this eviction, or the attempted eviction from Cabrillo Village, happens within a couple of months that the workers at Cabrillo Village win union recognition. They won union recognition in October of 1974, and by December of 74, going to 75, they're served eviction notices. Because the growers that the Saricoy and Limonera Associate understood that where the power was coming from. So we evict them, we demolish the homes, they scatter, they don't have any money. And the reason why these individuals, these families were fighting so hard, because their wages could not afford the market rate of housing. The housing was largely subsidized by the growers. And the reason was, and why, well, it wasn't because they had a big heart, is because you could control workers that way. You see who went in and out of the labor camps. If there were organizers there, then you exercise your private property rights, call in the sheriffs, call in the police. Then you also can threaten workers with eviction. Oh, you have this home, this 700 square foot home with 10 people in it. That was a reality. Reality today, maybe not so much in terms of families, but you're at multi-families now. 10 to 11 people in a family living in an 800 square foot cabin. That's what they would refer to as cabin. So they're resisting and they win. César Chávez says, want to solve this problem? Buy the homes. Buy the land, create your own housing. And they did. They created a cooperative and exists today. And this is a picture of one of the Cabrillo Village cabins. This reminds me of, you ever see those Jacob Riis images of the early 20th century in New York? This reminds me of a Jacob Riis image of the progressive era, where you had, like in New York, these tenements, what do you call it, shanty housing. This is the way Cabrillo Village was. And I had this verified that there was single-walled housing. I didn't know what, I'm not constructed. I had to look up. Single-walled housing, there's no barrier between the elements and inside. So I had single-walled housing. People were sleeping, and the wind was coming in constantly. They had to paper it with newspaper and put, starch over it too. That was their wallpaper. That was their reality. So that's the Cabrillo Village. There's Iocencia, actually her name is listed there. She was also a supporter of Cabrillo Village. And 4 years after the eviction started in Cabrillo Village, Rancho Césped is being evicted. So one more thing. Then there's the family, Jesus Gomez, is in the middle, Jesus? Guzman. Guzman. And his daughter at the left is Rosa Guzman. And I bring that, there's a video out there, if you Google search it, what's the name of that video, Ralph? Cabrillo Village, something, right? Yeah. Just look Cabrillo Village and look for a video, right? And there'll be a documentary on it. And it features, the main story of that is Rosa Guzman. She's a college student. But she's one of the individuals that César Chávez touched. It's like the can-do attitude. You've never done it, but now you're going to learn. Kind of going back to John Dewey, learn by doing. Right? And she became the voice of Cabrillo Village. I'm not exaggerating by that. She was at the bargaining table. And the story behind this, her father, Jesus Guzman, was part of the strikes in the early 1970s in Oxnard, and also in Fillmore, in Santa Paula. So when it came to them, they were ready. They were ready and organized and battle seasoned for the fight. And César Chávez says, basically, if you want to keep your homes, buy them. And they do. They buy them, long story short. And they then serve as a model for Rancho Césped when they get evicted in 1970. And that was a protracted fight from 1979 to about the late 1980s. And there's another image of Jesus Guzman and César Chávez. And one of the beauties of the stories, now they have, the trail commemorating Cabrillo Village, right? That was by the Sierra Club, put a little monument, a marker there. You can go there and see Cabrillo Village. And now the mural is being created and raising funds for the creation of a mural to commemorate this historical event of the preservation and actually the expansion of Cabrillo Village. Then we have Cabrillo Economic Development Corporation that devotes itself to not only farm worker housing, but low-income housing for everyone, so it expands. So if you want to be a part of supporting the mural project, talk to Ralph Martinez here. He's here in the front. He has flyers, right? And that's Ralph there. I got to interview Rosa Guzman there in the middle. She was visiting. She lives in Haiti now. She was visiting, so I put the tape recorder in front of her and got her story, and that's much of the lecture today is based on what she shared with us, right? So that's it. I'll take questions now. I think I left some time for questions. So, yeah. Okay, there you go. Thank you. Thank you. Questions or any question or a comment? Just keep them brief. Both a comment too. So. Yes, Cliff.
Frank, you showed the one picture of César with a comment below. He made comments on Ventura County. Did you read the article?
This one right here?
Yes. Did you see the article?
No, I didn't see the article.
Okay.
Okay.
What his comments were.
Well, if I read it, you mean where he's tired? He was basically saying he's tired of all the pressure and all that his union had faced in regards to the resistance, right? I'll have it. I can send it to you, Cliff, if you want to read it.
I've got that big sign in my car.
What's
right? The
what's-
marker.
You have it in your car?
What?
I don't want to put you out.
I just happened to. Because I've been traveling with it and showing it to different
Okay.
groups. Should I just go get it?
Oh, maybe people want to go follow you and go to your car rather than carrying it. Okay. All right. Thank you, Julie. Anybody else? Yes,
So who's
RJ.
today's César Chávez?
Huh?
Who's today's César Chávez?
That's a good question. What comes to my mind right now? We all are. We can't wait for somebody. You can't wait for somebody. If you have the drive, you have the passion, the willing to sacrifice and suffer, and that's what makes people special, right? In terms of the labor movement people, leaders, they were willing to sacrifice themselves. So that's the best I can answer that I have. Yes?
I was going to say that there's groups in Oxnard that help especially the indigenous
Yes.
farm workers that are there helping with clothing, food, some housing. It's always been an issue.
Definitely, yeah.
So,
Definitely. And I think part of the answer to that is our media. We don't have local newspapers really anymore. So we don't have the ability to recognize individuals. The LA Times doesn't even cover Oxnard or Ventura significantly at all. They used to have a branch of Ventura off of Main. Doesn't exist anymore. So media has really affected how people and movements are recognized with that.
does anybody know that there is a radio station, or there was, I haven't listened to it in a while, that transmit in Zapoteca, Nahuatl?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the groups are out there helping. They're just not very well known.
Yes, exactly.
Regular people.
I think I saw a hand right here somewhere. Yes, saw.
Dr. Barajas, thank you for your talk. Question I have
Thank you.
is, was there any successful businesses or elected officials that supported César Chávez's movement here in the county?
Oh, yes. Over time, that grows. One name that comes to mind immediately is now the deceased Foyer, Manuel Lopez, just one that off the top of there are many, many others. But that's a good point. I'm always, in terms, we have these days, Martin Luther King Day and César Chávez Day, and and other days similar. I'm always leery about these commemorations, these marches, because in the beginning of the careers of Martin Luther King and César Chávez and others like them, politicians didn't get close to them at all, because they were politically charged. They were anti-establishment, if you will, and politicians, didn't want to be labeled as a communist by association, by open support. But I always wonder, would politicians today be marching on whatever day if it was 1954, if it was 1972, right, or what have you? And that's my tension that I have about elected officials. I mean, elected officials only support those who, for the most part, are politically safe to do so. And where Edward Ribal comes to play, he came from the CSO. He was elected into office by the CSO, so he had a debt to pay for supporting the CSO and also the farm worker movement. So, but yes, definitely fundraisers. Manuel Lopez would have at his house over the years, even probably today through his widowed wife, Irma, right? Yes.
Were there any ranchers or farm owners or farmers or whatever that supported the union or were like favorable to farm workers, or was it all just like all these bad guys against workers?
Well, that's a great point. There's a hierarchy of growers too. There are the really powerful, and then there's the small independent family growers. And even César Chávez, an organizer, says, we really made a mistake in really targeting X family farm when they weren't really the problem. It was the Growers Association, the Lemon Association, the Strawberry Association, and it wasn't the individual X family. So yes, that's a great point, because that's what I try to fight against in my history, is not the good guys versus the bad guys. Because there were labor contractors that were Mexican that were exploiting Mexican workers. And they were working for the growers associations too. Hector Zamora comes into mind. He's the historical figure that was bringing braceros. Braceros are contracted workers from Mexico, and they're bringing them in to undercut the wages and the labor strike and the labor organizing of domestic homegrown workers. So it wasn't this us against them. It was really a mix of different interest groups. People, if I'm a labor contractor, that's my job, is to bring in labor, no matter what it is. But yes, there were families that they're not openly going to come out, and so that's where the newspapers comes in, right? In terms of the newspapers are not going to catch the growers, but they did understand to a certain point they had to negotiate because there was so much public pressure.
Dr. Barajas, do you want to share what was brought up from?
Oh yes, okay. Where's? So this is what's going to be hung up. Julie, do you want to help me hold this? It seems like it's quite heavy, actually. You're stronger than I am. Huh? Oh, there you. So this is good. This is to commemorate Cabrillo Village, and a mural is going to be placed there at Cabrillo Village that Ralph is organizing and spearheading there. Thank you. Maybe we could put it on the table so for people.
Here's the QR code if you want to watch the
Okay, there we go.
documentary with Rosa Guzman.
Maybe we could put it right here so people can see it on their way out. There you go. Thank you, Julie.
If I could just add to the mural, so I'm spearheading that. I'm the son of one of the farm workers, one of the original farm workers that worked at Cabrillo Village. Grew up in Cabrillo Village. I have a lot of memories. We're coming on the 50-year anniversary of Cabrillo Village's purchase from the growers. There was a mural that was painted back in 1978 that kind of depicted the history of Cabrillo Village, a little bit about the struggles and so forth, and over the years, graffiti, time, etc. It's just kind of disappeared. So on the heels of the 50th anniversary, which is in May of 2026, came across with the idea of getting a new mural up on that wall and kind of telling our story. We just started our fundraising about 2 weeks ago, so we're still in the early stages of it, but we're hoping, we've already got a muralist selected. We need to raise $18,000, so we're hoping to get that money to get it done, and we'll be working with the community, with the kids, everybody to hopefully get that up and going. So I got some flyers, I'll put them up on the table. If we run out, maybe just take a picture of the last one, so
Okay.
it's got QR code and some information.
Thank you, Rob.
Sorry, who's the muralist?
Elisa Torres.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What can we say? Can we get another round of applause for
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking your time today. We all learn something new every time. This is a great series, and we're looking forward. We just moved to move it into next year, so keep an eye out for future sessions. And we do have these recorded. Dr. Barajas, at the beginning, I was concerned because the camera was set up and you were moving all around. So we got that squared away. But you can find our recordings at bclandmarks.org. And we do appreciate your feedback. So we do have some feedback forms back on the table. So please feel free to fill one of those out. You can just leave it on the table. And with that, we do have a little bit of business to finish up, but we're going to take a little break so we can move over and take a look at the plaque. And we appreciate your coming today. So thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.